He rides into town like a storm. Long hair flowing, pistols on each hip, eyes scanning the saloon through a veil of cigar smoke. You've seen him before, in paintings, in Western films, even in video games. Wild Bill Hickok, the ultimate gunslinger. The noble lawman. The fastest draw in the West. A symbol of justice in a lawless land. Or so you've been told. But the truth? It's darker, meaner, and far more chaotic than the dime novels ever admitted. Wild Bill Hickok wasn't some clean-cut hero with an iron code of honor. He was a man haunted by violence, drunk with power, and addicted to the chaos he helped create. Behind every newspaper story was a body, often dropped for reasons as petty as gambling debts or bruised pride. And when he wasn't pulling the trigger, he was drowning in alcohol and paranoia, a ticking time bomb in every town he entered. This isn't just about tearing down a legend. It's about asking why we built it in the first place. Why we needed a killer to look like a knight. And why, even now, we still glorify a man who may have done more harm than good. The truth about Wild Bill Hickok starts here, and it's far from heroic. Before he became Wild Bill Hickok, he was just James Butler Hickok, a kid from Illinois who drifted west with big dreams and a quick temper. In his early years, there was nothing particularly heroic about him. He worked as a stagecoach driver, a lawman for hire, and sometimes a scout for the Union during the Civil War. He could shoot, sure. He could ride. But so could 1,000 other men on the frontier. What set Hickok apart wasn't his gun, it was the stories. And those stories didn't come from nowhere. In 1867, a young journalist named George Ward Nichols met Hickok in Springfield, Missouri. The timing was perfect. America, barely 2 years out of the Civil War, was hungry for legends. Nichols published an article in Harper's Monthly that catapulted Hickok to national fame. In it, Hickok was described as having killed over 100 men, some with each hand at the same time, always in self-defense, always with grace and moral clarity. The piece was thrilling, dramatic, and almost entirely fictional. The truth? Hickok likely killed 6 to 10 men in his lifetime, many under questionable circumstances. But the Nichols article spread like wildfire. Hickok was suddenly more than a man, he was a symbol. Newspapers dubbed him the Prince of the Pistoliers, and dime novelists rushed to print wild tales of his heroism. One even claimed Hickok had fought a grizzly bear barehanded. As the myth grew, so did Hickok's ego. He began wearing a long frock coat, twin ivory-handled pistols, and a wide-brimmed hat, costume choices more suited for theater than survival. It wasn't just performance. It was branding. But fame came at a cost. Hickok now had a reputation to live up to, and that meant keeping up the act, no matter how dangerous it became. He started accepting lawman jobs in frontier towns where violence was guaranteed. He took up gambling, drinking heavily, and challenging anyone who questioned his skill. More often than not, he brought violence with him wherever he went. What's particularly telling is how Hickok reacted to his own legend. In private, he reportedly hated the exaggerations, calling them damned lies. But in public, he embraced them. He posed for photographs with guns drawn, made appearances at public events, and even considered starring in his own stage show. For a brief time, he did join Buffalo Bill Cody's traveling Wild West show, but Hickok was terrible on stage. He mumbled lines, forgot cues, and was often too drunk to perform. The audience didn't care. They just wanted to see the legend in the flesh. Meanwhile, towns that hired Hickok as a lawman soon regretted it. He wasn't especially effective at maintaining order. In Hays, Kansas, he was involved in multiple fatal shootings, including the killing of an unarmed soldier during a drunken altercation. In Abilene, his final job as marshal ended in tragedy when Hickok accidentally killed his own deputy during a gunfight. That incident haunted him for the rest of his life. Yet somehow, the myth held strong. People believed in Wild Bill Hickok because they wanted to. They needed someone to embody the wildness and honor of the frontier, someone to make sense of a chaotic, violent land. And so, a flawed, erratic man was elevated into legend. The press turned him into a Western Arthur. The public treated him like royalty. And Hickok, for all his contradictions, played along, until the very end. But the cracks were already showing. Behind the legend was a man unraveling, broke, paranoid, drinking himself into oblivion. His final years were marked by wandering, gambling, and a deepening mistrust of everyone around him. The myth was still alive, but the man was falling apart. And yet, no matter how many lies the myth was built on, it endured. Because by the time Wild Bill realized the cost of the legend he helped create, it was already too late. Wild Bill Hickok's name became synonymous with death, not because of a righteous war against outlaws, but because wherever he went, someone ended up bleeding on the floor. While the legends claim he killed over 100 men, the real number is likely closer to 6. But the number itself isn't the point, it's the circumstances that matter. These weren't clean shootouts at high noon. They weren't heroic standoffs. Many of Hickok's kills were the result of arrogance, alcohol, and an uncontrollable temper. Take the famous duel with David Tutt in Springfield, Missouri, in 1865. It's often hailed as the first classic Western showdown, 2 men facing off in the street, one surviving, one not. But peel back the legend, and the truth is pathetic. The duel wasn't over honor or justice, it was over a gambling debt and a pocket watch. Tutt had taken Hickok's watch as collateral after a card game. Hickok warned him not to wear it in public. Tutt wore it anyway. So Hickok shot him dead. Just like that. Over pride. In the eyes of the law, it was ruled self-defense. In the eyes of history, it was the beginning of a reputation built on senseless bloodshed. That pattern repeated itself. In 1870, while serving as a marshal in Hays, Kansas, Hickok shot and killed Bill Mulvey, a man who had supposedly threatened him with a shotgun. Witnesses claimed Hickok fired without warning. The following month, he gunned down Samuel Strahan outside a saloon, again claiming self-defense. But again, the only witness backing his story was Hickok himself. And then came Abilene. It was 1871, and Hickok was hired as the town marshal, already carrying the weight of his reputation like a loaded weapon. He quickly developed a trigger-happy approach to law enforcement. Confrontations ended with bullets instead of arrests. Locals feared him as much as they respected him. The breaking point came when Hickok got into a gunfight with a man named Phil Coe, a saloon owner who allegedly drew on him in the middle of the street. Hickok fired 2 shots, killing Coe instantly. But in the chaos, he turned and fired again, this time striking and killing his own deputy, Mike Williams, who was running in to help. It was a catastrophic mistake. The guilt from that night never left him. Some say it was the beginning of Hickok's decline. Others say it was just another example of the chaos he brought with him everywhere he went. What's clear is that most of his so-called heroics were fueled by paranoia, alcohol, and a desperate need to uphold the legend the newspapers had created. Hickok didn't kill to defend justice, he killed to maintain his myth. He became so volatile that many towns refused to hire him, fearing the destruction that followed in his wake. His legend said he was the fastest gun in the West. The truth was, he was a man who couldn't back down, even when he should have walked away. Every conflict became a test of ego. Every insult became a death sentence. And the line between self-defense and manslaughter blurred with every bullet. By the time he reached the end of his life, Hickok was no longer feared as a lawman, he was pitted as a broken relic of a myth that had consumed him. He carried a body count, yes. But it wasn't a record of honor. It was a trail of blood, each death a reminder that the West didn't need heroes. It needed survivors. And Wild Bill Hickok was never very good at surviving. Wild Bill Hickok's reputation may have been forged with bullets, but it was liquor that eroded whatever was left of a man behind the myth. By the time he reached his early 30s, Hickok was already known not just as a gunslinger, but as a heavy drinker with a short fuse and a crumbling sense of control. Saloon after saloon, town after town, the pattern repeated itself. Hickok would enter with flair, sit in the corner with his back to the wall, and drink until he was either charming the room, or terrifying it. The stories that newspapers loved to print, the ones that painted him as a gentleman gunfighter, conveniently ignored the way alcohol turned him volatile. Bartenders and patrons alike described a man who could flip from calm to murderous in seconds. He would drink whiskey in silence, eyes locked on anyone who stared too long, and sometimes erupt into threats or gunplay with little provocation. In Hays City, Kansas, the accounts of his violence while drinking became so frequent that some citizens begged the town council to fire him. But Hickok was a double-edged sword. They feared him, but they also feared what would happen without him. Even fellow lawmen struggled to work with him. When sober, Hickok could be courteous, even charismatic. But when drunk, he became unpredictable, sometimes bragging about the men he'd killed, other times slipping into silence and paranoia. He reportedly once pulled his pistol on a child who ran too close behind him on the street, thinking he was being ambushed. That's the tragedy of Hickok's myth. The same instincts that made him fast with a gun also made him unable to relax, to trust, to be human. Drinking didn't just dull his edges, it sharpened his paranoia. He believed enemies lurked around every corner, that each stranger might be there to test him, to make a name by gunning down the famous Wild Bill. And so, the alcohol became both shield and poison, a way to calm his nerves and feed the very delusions that made him dangerous. On one occasion, Hickok got into an argument with a fellow gambler over a game of poker. Witnesses said Hickok, visibly intoxicated, accused the man of cheating and slammed his pistol on the table. The tension nearly exploded into gunfire before others intervened. These weren't isolated incidents. This was his life now, drinking, lashing out, barely avoiding disaster. It's no coincidence that as Hickok's drinking worsened, his usefulness as a lawman disappeared. Towns began to see him not as a protector but as a liability. His once brilliant reflexes dulled. His judgment faltered. And worst of all, his growing reliance on alcohol exposed just how much of his myth was covering up fear, insecurity, and trauma. It's likely that Hickok suffered from what we'd now call PTSD. The violence he lived through during the Civil War, the constant threat of assassination, the friends he accidentally killed, it all built up inside him. But instead of healing, he drank. And instead of stepping away, he leaned harder into the legend. One local described him as a man haunted by ghosts he couldn't name. Another said, when he drank, he didn't become someone else, he became more of what he already was. The final irony is that Hickok's drinking didn't just destroy his reputation, it may have helped end his life. On the day he was murdered in Deadwood, he was drinking and gambling as usual. He ignored the signs, dismissed the danger, and allowed a man he barely knew to walk up behind him. The same man who shot him in the back of the head while Hickok held 2 aces and 2 eights in his hand. That moment would become legend. But the slow descent into that chair, the years of rage, booze, and broken trust, that was the real story. Wild Bill Hickok didn't die when the bullet struck his skull. He'd been dying for years, one drink at a time. By the time Wild Bill Hickok reached the height of his fame, he was no longer a man, he was a myth with a heartbeat. But the bigger the legend grew, the more it devoured him from the inside out. Hickok's name inspired both awe and challenge. Young gunslingers rode into towns just to face him. Drunks bragged in saloons about what they'd do if they ever met him. Newspapers printed tall tales of his supposed invincibility, and every town he entered seemed to already know the script. Wild Bill walks in, trouble follows, someone dies. And Hickok knew it. He felt it in every glare, every whisper, every backdoor creak. Fame became a noose, slowly tightening. His paranoia, already sharpened by alcohol and trauma, now took over his daily life. He refused to sit with his back to any entrance, ever. He would walk into a room and scan every face before he sat. He carried 2 pistols, loaded and ready, even at the card table. Friends said he'd often freeze mid-sentence, staring at a figure who looked familiar or suspicious, hand drifting to his gun belt without realizing it. Sleep was hard. Peace was impossible. He no longer trusted anyone, not strangers, not lawmen, not even those who called him friend. What made it worse was that the fear wasn't irrational. Hickok had made enemies everywhere. He killed men in Kansas, fought Confederates during the war, humiliated outlaws in public showdowns, and shamed gamblers in saloons. All of them, or their brothers, sons, cousins, might want revenge. And the price of killing a legend was fame. Hickok knew that any fool with a pistol and nothing to lose might try. So he walked through the West like a hunted animal, pretending to be the predator. The pressure of his persona also meant he couldn't ever show weakness. If he let his guard down, if he backed off from a fight or turned away from a challenge, he risked unraveling the entire myth. So he leaned in. He kept the guns polished. He wore the long black coat. He barked at bartenders who stared too long and dared anyone to test him. It wasn't bravery. It was survival theater. And it was slowly killing him. There were moments when the mask slipped. A few rare friends described Hickok in private as exhausted, lost, and strangely gentle. He would talk about leaving it all behind, finding peace, living quietly. But then someone would recognize him on the street, shout his name, ask for a story. The legend would flicker back into his eyes, and the fragile man underneath would disappear. Even his time with Buffalo Bill Cody's traveling show revealed the toll of his fame. Audiences expected a theatrical killer. Hickok gave them mumbled lines, missed cues, and hollow eyes. He wasn't built to be a showman. He was already unraveling, already afraid of shadows that might be real. After the show failed, he drifted. No longer a lawman, no longer a performer, he became a relic, celebrated but irrelevant, famous but aimless. And all the while, he was sure someone was coming for him. He spoke of it constantly. That someone, someday, would finally get lucky. That even legends bleed. He was right. In the end, it wasn't a duel. It wasn't a showdown at high noon. It was a bullet from behind, fired by a coward in a saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota. But even before that shot was fired, Hickok had already been consumed. By the stories. By the fear. By the impossible weight of being Wild Bill. The man was long gone. All that was left was the legend, and legends, as Hickok knew better than anyone, don't get to grow old. It was August 2nd, 1876, and Wild Bill Hickok walked into Nuttall and Mann's saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota, a lawless gold rush town where legends came to fade. He was older now, 39, his eyesight failing, his reflexes dulled, and his nerves wrecked from years of violence and fear. But still, the name carried weight. People whispered when he entered, gave him space. He took his usual seat at the poker table, facing the door as always. But on that day, the seat he wanted was taken, and for the first time anyone could remember, Hickok sat with his back to the entrance. It was a small detail, but it would prove fatal. Sitting behind him was Jack McCall, a drifter with no reputation, no future, and a head full of resentment. The day before, Hickok had embarrassed McCall after a poker game, tossing him a few coins and suggesting he buy himself a proper breakfast. It wasn't meant as cruelty, maybe just a jab, maybe even a joke. But McCall took it personally. He returned the next day with a pistol, walked up behind Hickok while he played his hand, and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok never saw it coming. He died instantly. The cards he held, 2 black aces and 2 black eights, would go down in legend as the dead man's hand. For a man who had spent years staring down barrels, who had killed to avoid being killed, who had lived every day expecting an ambush, it ended with a cheap shot from a nobody. There was no honor, no epic duel, no final quip. Just blood, silence, and a legend crumpled over a poker table. McCall fled but was quickly caught. He was tried twice, first acquitted in Deadwood by a drunken jury, then retried and hanged when the federal government stepped in. But justice, like everything else in Hickok's story, came late and hollow. His death wasn't a heroic finale. It was a grim joke played by fate. The man who built a life around watching his back died the one time he didn't. Wild Bill Hickok died slumped over a poker table, but the legend didn't die with him. In fact, it only grew stronger. Within days of his death, newspapers across the country were printing sensational headlines, dramatic sketches, and exaggerated retellings. Suddenly, the man who had died in a saloon like any other drunken gambler was reborn in print as a tragic hero, a fallen knight of the Wild West. People didn't mourn Hickok the man, they mourned the idea of him. And that idea, polished by dime novelists in Hollywood decades later, has proven nearly impossible to kill. But why? Why do we still believe in Wild Bill Hickok as a noble gunslinger when the facts scream otherwise? Part of it is timing. America in the late 19th century was in the midst of a deep identity crisis. The Civil War had left the country fractured. The West, still untamed, became the canvas onto which a wounded nation projected its fantasies, of rugged individualism, of good triumphing over evil, of man versus wilderness. Hickok, conveniently, fit the mold. He had the look, the name, the gun. He wasn't clean, but he was useful. Writers turned him into a frontier paladin, a man who dispensed justice in a land without laws. His flaws were either erased or romanticized. His violence was justified. His drinking, overlooked. His paranoia, rebranded as vigilance. Even the way he died was reworked into poetry, a gunslinger brought low not by weakness but by treachery. The truth was messy, but legends don't thrive on truth. They thrive on simplicity. Hickok's story became a morality tale: live fast, die young, and leave behind a myth too big to question. And so the myth marched on. In the early 1900s, Buffalo Bill Cody's traveling Wild West show continued to portray Hickok as one of its founding heroes. In the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood took over, casting him in film after film, always as the straight-shooting, reluctant hero. In comic books, in radio plays, in television shows, Hickok's myth was passed down like scripture. He became part of America's national folklore. But the deeper reason we still believe the lie is because the lie serves a purpose. Wild Bill Hickok allows us to tell ourselves that the American frontier was ultimately noble, that violence can be righteous if done by the right hands, that justice doesn't need rules as long as the gun is in the hands of a good man. It's comforting. It simplifies the brutal, complicated history of westward expansion into a digestible myth. Hickok becomes the mask we put over genocide, land theft, lawless bloodshed, and frontier chaos. As long as he's there, staring down bad guys in the middle of Main Street, we don't have to talk about the bodies in the dirt around him. And we don't have to confront the real truth, that many so-called heroes of the Old West were, in fact, violent, unstable men propped up by opportunistic storytellers. The most tragic part is that even Hickok himself seemed to know it. He wasn't dumb. He read the papers. He saw how he was being turned into a character he couldn't control. He tried, sometimes, to tell the truth. But the truth didn't sell. And the people didn't want it. In the end, Wild Bill Hickok was a man who couldn't live up to the legend that was built around him. He tried. He played the part. He wore the coat, posed for the photos, leaned into the myth. But it broke him. It isolated him. And ultimately, it killed him. Today, his face still stares back from murals, statues, and tourist traps. His name graces saloons and casinos. But the man, the real, flesh and blood man, is gone, buried beneath layers of fiction that we continue to protect. Because tearing down Wild Bill doesn't just threaten one story. It threatens the entire fantasy of the Wild West. And that's a truth far more dangerous than any gunfight. So who was Wild Bill Hickok, really? Strip away the legend, the movie posters, the silver-plated revolvers behind glass, and what's left is not a hero, but a deeply troubled man with a fast trigger finger and an addiction to danger. He wasn't a symbol of justice. He wasn't the calm sheriff who tamed the wild town. He was, more often, the reason the town became wild in the first place. He drank too much, fought too often, and killed not out of noble duty, but out of pride, impulse, and fear. Yes, he could shoot. Yes, he had moments of bravery. But that alone does not make a man good, and it certainly doesn't make him worthy of sainthood. We've called Hickok a lawman, but he rarely followed the law. We've called him a hero, but few of his victims would agree. He was unstable, dangerous, and drifting. The longer he lived, the more he unraveled, until even those who once admired him saw a man barely holding himself together. And yet, we made him eternal. We built statues of him. Named towns after him. Put him on postage stamps. We turned a drunken gambler who shot men over poker games into a timeless icon. Why? Because the truth is uncomfortable. Because it's easier to worship a myth than to confront the violence and instability behind it. Because Wild Bill Hickok fits the story we want to tell about ourselves, that rugged man, alone and unshakable, carved civilization out of chaos with their own two hands and a smoking gun. But the real history of the American West is not a story of heroes. It's a story of survivors, of broken men and brutal acts, of systems that failed and legends that lied. And Wild Bill Hickok was just one of many who stepped into that void and found immortality not by being good, but but by being dramatic, dangerous, and unforgettable. In the end, he wasn't a hero with a badge. He was a drunk with a gun. And the fact that we still confuse the two says more about us than it ever did about him.